Agentic Commerce best practices that discuss key business implications, strategic considerations, and the predictions shaping the future of the industry. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. We have our leader of the conversation, our CEO and founder, Deborah Weinswig, who will be joined by David Ingram, Group Chief Product Officer at Rezolve Ai. For those on the call unfamiliar with Rezolve, Rezolve is at the forefront of agentic commerce, a true global leader in AI-powered commerce and digital engagement solutions. The company helps retailers and brands drive growth through intelligent search, personalization, seamless transactions, automated fulfillment, and marketing personalization. With expected revenue exceeding over $350 million expected for this year and strategic partnerships with tech leaders such as Microsoft and Google, Rezolve is playing a key role in shaping the future of commerce and specifically agentic commerce. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask any questions during the webinar, and we'll do our best to get to all those during the conversation and after the content. And with that, I'll pass it over to our host, Deborah Weinswig.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here with David and all of you. And thanks, whether it's your morning, afternoon, evening, for joining us, because this truly has arrived quickly. I think that's a great way to say it. We were just talking about before the call started, if we kind of rewind from a Coresight perspective, when we really started to put AI, Gen AI, that is, under a microscope with our AI Council in August of 23. And for the first year, right, we were all kind of together trying to figure out, the frameworks, what mattered, where to invest. The second year was building kind of a lot of that, kind of picks and shovels and foundational layer. And then this third year, let's call it starting in August of 25, and what we're still in, is really where Rezolve sits in building this kind of how we've thought about it from a Coresight perspective, this kind of commerce operating system. And as we look at holiday 26, we believe that we're going to continue to see more announcements, like the ones that we're seeing here, and that this is going to truly transform how we think about customer service, how we think about product availability, but so much of the customer journey is really being augmented. And we believe that, this will be kind of our agentic holiday season, if you will. And so as we think about, right, like the size, if you will, when we put our pen to paper and, right, we have an entire market research team and dove into the details, it was truly bigger than, I would say, and if you think about it over time, anything we've seen and the impact on retail. I mean, not to date myself, but to date myself, I still remember when, we were looking at different e-commerce numbers and it was going to be, right, like, oh my gosh, 30% of retail. And, no one was ever going to go to a store again, which of course didn't happen. The 30% in some categories absolutely did, like, furniture and home, et cetera. But when we look at how the shopping journey is changing and how quickly, right, this almost kind of 1 trillion, if you will, dollar number, that is, when we're thinking about it as being kind of influenced, mediated, orchestrated, however you want to think about it, by an agentic experience. And I will say, when I am doing research, personally or professionally, the amount of information now available to me is immense to make a better decision. And I think today, right, this whole kind of foundation being built right now is really helping retailers, those who jump in with both feet, kind of helping them be poised to capture this next wave of growth. So David, with that as kind of like a long-winded introduction, what do you believe to be the primary demand drivers right now behind this rapid market acceleration?
Hi, Deb. Hi, everyone. No, actually it's a great introduction. Thank you very much, and a brilliant question. I've got to say, it puts me back in mind of my early days in e-commerce in the mid-90s, when there really wasn't any such thing as e-commerce, and folks would say to me when I was talking to retail as well, how many people are online anyway? And, and we would go and drag out those Nielsen charts and figures and say, well, quite a few people are online, and there'll be quite a few more soon. It's worth taking notice of this. We know the real answer now is that everybody's online all the time on multiple devices, even when they're doing everything else. So I think, forecasts like this, the primary drivers, three things. Consumer behavior, it's already changed, right? We're all, outside of our professional lives, consumers, and we're increasingly expressing our intent conversationally rather than navigating websites manually. Very many of us go first to AI, then to a brand e-commerce site. I think that's the first driver. Just consumer behavior is changing. Second, technology. It's crossed a threshold, I'd say. The models are now good enough to really properly understand context. You can do really good product comparisons. They're very good at guiding decisions, and it feels extremely natural, as I'm sure we've all discovered. So as consumers, we already feel like it's doing a pretty good job of the discovery. And I think I said there were three. I think the third driver is that retailers are really starting to recognize now that AI, it's no longer just a productivity tool, right? It's a revenue enabler. I think what we're going to see is today AI is influencing discovery and recommendation, but it will start to move towards transactions, as we know. We all anticipate that, right? And that's what really does lead to the growth. So in terms of numbers, I think back again 30 years, the exact forecast may change, but the direction of travel is very, very clear, and it's huge.
I think you're right, and I think what's really interesting, you talked about at Coresight, right? Our one of our passions is live streaming, live commerce, and we've likened that kind of trajectory to what we've seen in terms of actual this kind of idea of on this next chart, right? 4% of consumers cited having completed a purchase using Gen AI. So if you think about it, kind of like checking out inside of an LLM, et cetera, and that's kind of what we've seen with live commerce. But the idea around discovery, and I think I really liked how you put it, the conversational commerce. I mean, I'm in large cities all over the world, and right, like, I do very much observe consumers consuming, and right, what you see is consumers saying, I'm looking for this or that, and they're having a conversation, and to them, once again, I think you put it very well, it's very natural. And so this idea that before you buy something, you can because if you think about it, right, typing is very kind of staccato almost, and this idea of when you're talking and thinking about your purchase, I also believe something very important is that we're going to see a significant decline in returns, because consumers are going to have a better understanding of what it is that they're purchasing, right? If you think about it, is that a lilac or is that a periwinkle, right? What's the color really, right? What's the drop from like the waist to the floor? These questions that I think, yes, can you find them if you're like pecking and hunting? Maybe that's the thing as well. You may not be able to, and consumers don't always trust reviews online, and so I think this idea that consumers are 29% surveyed are more likely to shop on a website with an AI chatbot. I mean, I look at that as like that's just kind of the door opening, right? And this holiday season, I think, is really going to be this agentic holiday season. And as we think about the number of consumers who are consuming in this new way, if you look at it, kind of trust and control are critical. And I think consumers worry about privacy, I think, more than anything. That's what I've heard. I think this frictionless checkout And as we've seen, different LLMs have approached this, in different ways. And lastly, I mean, one of the challenges could be inertia, right? People are used to doing things in a certain way, and you do have to train yourself. And I think that this, David, is something that I'd love to hear your take on, because since things are changing so rapidly, right, how I bought something or how I approached it a few weeks ago is different today. And that can be stressful for the consumer. So, I think there's a substantially large cohort, 60% of shoppers leveraging Gen AI to shop, but direct purchases, as I would have expected, are still, at a, we'll call it a minimal amount. What do you see as the biggest impediments influencing this kind of conversion gap? Do you think it's time, or do you also think it's this kind of continuous change for the consumer journey and the consumer still trying to figure out what that means?
There's a lot that's contained in this slide, and so many things we could talk about here, but something you said a little earlier there really struck a chord with me, and that is you talked about how we sort of click and peck today on e-commerce websites. And there's this realization that many of us are having, that the shopping experience, when you go into a store, like a really good store, right? Imagine anything that anyone on this call, anything that you're really interested in, whether it be running shoes or whether it be tech, whatever it is. You imagine going into the best store and speaking to the best store assistant. It's actually quite a creative process, isn't it? When you get to the checkout's very transactional. We just want it to be quick, but that product discovery is quite a creative process, almost and in many cases also a social process, particularly if you're shopping for fashion, right? So I think that that's a really interesting fact in and of itself, because the devices we use today in that user interface, in that UX for e-commerce, are very transactional, right? Search, click, tap, keywords, maybe semantic search, filters, sorting, pagination. It's all actually very transactional, and it's not a very creative experience. So the idea of a Gen AI shopping assistant brings the promise that I can have a much more sort of beautiful, natural, creative, satisfying shopping experience. And then when you get to the checkout, of course, you just want it to happen quickly. But to your main point, friction. I have also heard it said that the next challenge is trust. But I've heard that too, and I do think it's a real thing. But I don't necessarily think it's the highest bar, because as humans, we're quite trusting of technology. If OpenAI or Claude or Gemini, if it offers me an option to actually buy something following on from a discovery, I think that the trust that we've already established with those services sort of gets syndicated into that process. And strangely enough, and almost perversely enough, the less tech aware we are, and I think about folks in my family who don't work in tech, the more we trust. We sort of follow the crowd. We see it happening. Once we start to see it happening, we're not reading papers and documents to decide whether we trust this thing. We go on behavior and gut feel, and we go on early experiences. So I think these early experiences of discovery build trust. And then when the transactions are added, then the trust gets syndicated. But I think actually the real friction point, I think it's tech maturity and adoption. That's where I think it is. We're still very much at the start curve.
Yeah,
There's lots of.
leads.
I was going to say that we've all seen the partnerships of sort of big AI and big retail, but the reason we hear about them is because of the press activity that goes behind them, and they require that relationship between the parties to make them work, because the tech and the standards are still maturing. But as the standards and the tech mature, then you don't so much need a tight commercial or organizational relationship between the parties to be able to utilize the tech, just in the same way that we can use an API today without necessarily having to have a conversation with somebody in the supplier's organization. part behavioral, but I think humans trust more than we think they do, more than we in tech think they do, but also standards and maturity there.
Yeah, I think your point around these kind of commercial relationships, and also if I think back once again, even a year ago, how critical that relationship and that press release and whatnot were to things moving forward. And today, like you said, we can just use an API call, to an API call to do everything. We had a great question in the chat from Lockie on which platforms make the most sense. And if you can also, David, help us kind of contextualize, do we need to think about platform? Do we need to think about process? What do retailers and brands need to think about? And once again, let's have an eye on like holiday 26.
I don't see the question in the chat, so I don't know whether I'm seeing the questions. Could you just clarify the question for me, and I'll try and answer it now for sure.
Yep, there's chats and Q&As and everything. So it's which platforms make the most sense. So it's very much kind of like, how do you think about platform? But right, we can also interpret platform to mean many different things as well. So maybe if you can explain, how do you think about platform? And like I said, I look at Rezolve as this kind of commerce operating system. So how do you think about, kind of getting from the foundational layer to the commerce layer?
Yeah, okay. So I could probably take the question in a number of different ways when we say platform. So I hope I guess right here. What I see is a lot of folks in retail conducting experiments based on platforms like OpenAI, ChatGPT, to create that conversational, honestly, a chatbot. That's fast to do. You can get a smart developer, not even a developer, and vibe code something of a prototype literally over a weekend and get it live. But taking that into production it's another thing entirely. When Rezolve started doing this, I think almost 6 years ago now, we thought that we would be building something of a layer on top of one of the general AIs. But what we discovered is it requires a lot of prompt engineering and prompt engineering and prompt engineering and prompt engineering to keep the AI on track, within the guardrails, brand safe, not hallucinating in terms of either just talking about stuff off topic or talking about products that don't exist or inventing pricing. So we took the decision that we would build our own AI platform. So we have a number of models, some large, some medium, some small, some nanos. They'll do slightly different things in that essentially sales process. Some handle the general opening discussion, very empathetic. Some handle product retrieval from a product catalog. So they're much more procedural, doing tool calling, so they're grounded in the products. Some handle the parting discussion, so the intent that when a consumer expresses intent to add something to the cart, there's a lot that goes along with that: size, colors, variance, quantity, add to cart, remove from cart, view cart, and then checkout. Think about what goes into a checkout: payment methods, delivery address, invoicing address, maybe discount codes. Maybe I want to add a new payment method, change to use one of my others. There's so much that goes into these, and it's really difficult to build that on a general LLM. So we have a comma. I specifically don't want this to be a sales pitch, and it isn't, but we've had to do a lot of work to build our platform, which is multi-agents and multi-models, multiple agents on top of those, the orchestration between them, and the tool calling to make sure that it's robust, industrial strength, production strength. And I wonder whether that does answer the question, whether I picked the right definition of platform for the person who asked the question.
No, I think that's really helpful. And also we've seen, going back to your whole point around kind of product retrieval from the product catalog, a lot of websites will display out of stock items, which we find is one of the more frustrating things for consumers. And so, this idea around this, journey kind of changing, I think is, apropos. We had another great question from Kevin. What is the commercial impact of agentic commerce on retail media businesses, given that agents ignore ads? Great question.
Sorry, just recap the question. I was just responding to somebody posting a LinkedIn link there.
Sure. And what is the commercial impact of agentic commerce on retail media businesses, given that agents ignore ads?
I don't yet have a solid answer for that one. I've got to admit, retail media isn't a business that Rezolve is primarily in today, so I won't go out on a limb and suppose there. But I want, Deborah, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I think it goes back to for holiday 26, right? This idea around how do you personalize and customize the experience. I'm very big on gamification, right? From what I've seen, globally, that has a huge impact on conversion, especially at checkout in some cases, but truly throughout the journey. And I've always thought of retail media done right can be gamification, but I think that can look different as well. And so I just think that this whole, first of all, there's different ways for retail media to play out, but I think a traditional ad, when the consumer is aware that it's an ad, right, that can also create friction, I think, in the shopping journey. So I think that we will see this opportunity because, and I think Kevin's question also goes back to, it's been a huge right, just coming off of earnings, right? So many retailers have talked about how much of an impact it's had on bottom line. And so I think as a revenue source for retailers or as a, kind of margin driver, it's been really critical. And I think there's certainly other ways for them to monetize, but that one has been, I think, kind of incredibly important. So that's where I think we're seeing things continue to change. So we have a lot of questions, which we will try and do our best to get to all of them, but we also have a lot of slides. So I'll do my best to balance. But I think this kind of really summarizes how we're thinking about this kind of future of commerce. And, whether it's this idea around kind of an inbound agent, an on-site assistant, or an outbound agent. And, I think that the one I wanted to spend time defining is this idea of the outbound agent. So AI that is kind of, proactively leaves the retailer's ecosystem to be present across, right, kind of key external Gen AI shopping platforms, because that's where we're getting the most questions. And, we kind of define, David, these distinct, kind of agent layers here. But what are retailers focusing on today? And is that different from where they should be focusing?
Also a good question. So I love this slide. I think this is a really good way of thinking about this, and I'll add another overlay on it in terms of thinking about the user journey, where the users are coming from. So I'd say today many retailers are focused on that internal one, so the on-site assistant, let's say the middle layer. And I like to call that on-pain, right? So I'll contrast on-pain meaning on one of your brand properties, whether it's web or mobile or whatever it is, with off-pain, which is a human interacting with an AI assistant or agent interacting with your website. And I think merchants are focusing on that today and feeling slightly nervous of the larger topic of agentic commerce in the round, particularly where the consumer journey starts off pain. And I think that's because we have a little more control over what's happening on pain on our brand site. It's more familiar. Right? You can, as a retailer, you can control the experience on pain on your brand site. You can control the brand. The implementation feels much more straightforward. It's under our control. But the bigger challenge is those inbound and outbound layers that you show, or the off pane. But if I try and define them, inbound, we're thinking about that as that's where consumers are arriving through an AI agent like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, either a human driving that or an agent arriving through that route. Whereas outbound, and by the way, that's happening right now, whether you're participating in the counterpart to that, which is outbound agents. So outbound agents are where retailers are proactively participating in those AI-driven journeys. So that might be a counterpart API on their side to expose catalog data, inventory, pricing, or it might be actually intelligent agents on the merchant's side to interact with the inbound agents. And I do think retailers should absolutely improve the on-pane experience, because again, as consumers, we're all retraining ourselves to ask to discover products in a different way. So that needs to be done. But I think merchants also need to think about, are they discoverable? Are they showing up? Is their data sufficiently well structured to be able to show up to inbound agents? And are they making those tools available on the outbound side? So as I said, APIs or agents for inventory, products, orders, user identity. So you've got to play everywhere. On-site is under your control, more familiar, good place to start. Inbound is happening without you even knowing it. Outbound is where you get to play the counterpart to the inbound. And I think folks need to start thinking about that as well.
And if you were to assign percentages just for kicks and giggles, where would you say retailers are spending their time right now? And what do you think that looks like as we move into 27?
Good question. I don't have data on that, so I'll have to go on what I detect when I'm talking to folks. Home DIY hardware retailer last week, and they set themselves a BHAG, right? A big hairy goal, big hairy audacious goal, a BHAG, to be accepting what we would describe here as inbound transactions by the end of the year. But as I said to them, some of that is outside of your control at the moment. Maybe you want to be setting an interim step, a first step that you can achieve faster and start to prove ROI, thinking about those on-site assistants. While you're working on the outbound and the inbound and the outbound side, you can deliver on-site much more quickly and reliably. So I don't think I didn't really answer the question, but I don't have data to say. But my instinct is folks see the big agentic commerce story and know they should be doing something and gravitate towards the whole picture. But you can chunk it down and break it down and do something smaller, faster, lighter to prove more quickly.
That's why I think that's why I really like this slide, going back to...
That's a perfect segue, right? That was not a setup, but brilliant.
Yeah, no, but I think it really kind of, it's really helpful as we then kind of move to the store framework and we think about kind of what can retailers do today? What do they maybe need to get buy-in across the organization? And then, what do they need to think about in terms of, shareholder, customer, employee? I mean, it's a lot to think about. The area I think that, there's this almost interesting interplay right now, and I'd love to get your take between tech and operations, and almost who owns this. And so what are you seeing, David, as companies are making some of these decisions? and what's slowing them down, and then by the same, I always like to look at the glass half full, what's helping them speed up?
It's definitely not just a tech project, right? A tech is an enabler, but it's not the driver. The ownership needs to be cross-functional. It's a transformation. It's not just a UX change. So it includes digital, e-commerce, customer experience, operations, merchandising, everything. Yeah. They've all got an interest and a role. If I had to pick one executive sponsor, I'd be choosing whoever owns growth and customer experience. I'll start there. Ultimately, it sort of sits with customer value and almost operational execution. Don't make it just a tech project.
Yeah, I will just share with you that we've seen supply chain have a bigger seat at the table than I would have expected in the which once again is very near and dear to my heart. But it's interesting if we think about the store framework, kind of how supply chain has a slice of each, of STORE. Why do you think that is? Because it's one of those things I've been, I think, wrangling with.
So Deborah, I noticed that in the last AI Council meeting that you invited me to, I noticed there was a strong sort of bias on the conversation to back office and supply chain. And actually, honestly, I felt a little out of place because Rezolve is more on that sort of consumer facing side, the sales. But it's interesting. Well, AI is definitely a great productivity tool. And that's going to help pretty much anything. That's a blanket statement, but it has the potential to help a lot of things in your back office and your operations and your sort of BAU. But I'm looking at it, and in Rezolve, we're looking at it more in the sort of end consumer side, at least for now. I'm sure we will be going back up the supply chain, but right now we're downstream towards consumers. And we see it as more than it's not just a productivity tweak there. It's not just a UX change. It's foundational. I always think, I go back again to my 30-year history in e-commerce. And I think for me, there was life before e-commerce and there was life after the introduction of e-commerce, and they're totally different things. And that's what's happening here. We will look back on this, all of us, and think there was life before AI in commerce and there's life after AI in commerce, and it's a totally different thing. It's not just a productivity increment. It's just a completely different way of selling, and then for consumers, a different way of buying.
And I wonder, I think you may have almost answered it, which is if it's a different way of buying and selling, then the expectations of this kind of in stock, this kind of frictionless, right, delivery, right, going back to some of the supply chain angles. And then also, I think the transparency around, kind of production. And I think that the consumer starts to think about, right, maybe it's really interesting, David, to unpack this a bit. Maybe, right, because there's now so much information around making a better purchase, which, like I said, I do believe this is going to drive down returns. So we'll have a very high ROI as we move to more agentic commerce, that the consumer's level of expectations, going back to this whole kind of conversational nature that you mentioned, right, their ability to inquire, to find out more, right, it could even be if it's, kind of 92% nylon and 8%, elastane versus 90 and 10, right? How does the garment feel differently, right? I think that we're going to see them ask more questions so that when they finally, when they make a decision, their utils of happiness, if you will, are higher. We have a good question for Brian, as a small, and Dave, these are in like the Q&A chat, as a small regional retailer, how do we get started thinking about this transition, and how can Rezolve help us make this transition, and what does the onboarding look like? And what does the implementation journey look like as well?
Again, I'd say start on pain, because you have the greatest control there. There are fewer variables that are outside of your control. You can make fast progress. You asked onboarding process. I do think you can prototype quickly with smart folks something on a general AI platform. I do not think that is the way to go for a production system. And because I work for Rezolve and I'm part of Rezolve, I'm of course going to say that I think our platform is the best for retailers to start on. And we run a what we call a fast start agentic commerce pilot program. So it's hard to avoid being a salesperson there. My answer would be that let's genericize it. Find a partner that's an expert in agentic commerce and has been doing this for a while. Find a partner that has something more than just a thin layer over the top of one of the general AIs, and see if they have some sort of accelerator program that you can get on, where they're helping you put some constraints around what you could do, so that you have a clear playbook, if you like.
I think that's really, because I think what we're seeing, and I love that idea around kind of, helping you kind of self-impose guardrails almost, because what we're seeing is this, and I hate to use this terminology because we did it all the time on Wall Street, right? Analysis paralysis, but A, things are changing so rapidly. B, right? What I love is that if I can imagine it, I can probably do it, and it may not look perfect, but I think that we're all okay with that. But this idea that if someone in your organization, right, has the kind of intent, there is now this kind of going back to this ROI roadmap for agentic commerce, their ability to kind of number 5, right, monitor and iterate. So to try, I've always been a big fan of like small wins, because versus like the BHAG, right, like that can almost slow you down, because there's so many individual kind of check boxes. But as we think about kind of this 5-step framework for, and right, I always think about the investment, because to get right shareholders, to get Wall Street, to get that support, there needs to be this data that I think is very easily understood. And I think going back to earnings, right, we're hearing a lot more about the impact of agentic and what that means. And so what we've seen, though, is that many retailers struggle to establish kind of, right, like number 1, right? How do you define success? Because also success means something different if you're in marketing or merchandising or supply chain. And so what are you seeing, David, in terms of either data that they're looking at, or, it can be quantitative or qualitative. What are they looking at to kind of help them develop a more actionable roadmap?
Yeah, so I'm glad you said quantitative and qualitative, because it is a bit of both. If you start with the customer journey, and I'd say today's traditional sort of e-commerce metrics still apply, right? You want to know how and where you got found. How did folks land with me? Where are they coming from? But also then KPIs like conversion, abandonment, average order value, those sorts of things, they still apply. And to your point about defining success metrics, right? Stage 1, that's the baseline against which you're going to measure actual results. You don't need perfect data, but you need enough visibility to understand whether anything that you do moves the needle. So that's not rocket science. We're all doing that today. We're running experiments, A/B tests. But I also think with agentic commerce, and particularly with conversational, it's a completely different style of, I was going to say transaction, interaction. And that's why I think we see new metrics emerging. So there's something that's not quite pinned down yet here, where we get to combine those empirical business metrics, right, the ones we can actually put decimals on, and then some less precise, more emotional metrics. So it's actually something I'm working on in Rezolve at the moment. There's some sort of metric that combines how well did we understand the consumer's intent and deliver them satisfaction, which are two things that are less easy to measure, and deliver those solid empirical business metrics. There's some combination. So if you just think about a couple of examples, if you're going through a conversational AI-driven discovery type scenario through to a transaction, and you have a reasonably short conversation, like you get to the products that you want quickly, and the sentiment in that exchange is good, and you get a transaction at the end. So you've got sort of a short interaction, good sentiment, and a positive business signal at the end. That's good, right? But what about if the conversation actually is a bit longer and a bit more protracted? That's not necessarily a bad signal if the sentiment of the conversation is good, and you can measure that real time. As long as you get, again, a positive business outcome, that's probably also good. But what about if it's a long conversational flow and the sentiment isn't so great? You can detect the users getting frustrated. So even if you come out with a positive outcome, is that still good? I think that the industry hasn't yet really nailed the new metrics for this era. And this is why it is something I'm working on in Rezolve to try and define it. But I do believe it's a combination of the existing business outcomes that we actually want, right? We want sales, we want high order values, we want high conversion, we want large basket size, we want lots of customers, we want them all to return. We also want a bunch of other stuff as well, which is a little softer. So we want strong advocates, we want people that are really satisfied, that love us, that love our products, that have a great experience with us. So no, I feel somewhat like I might have dodged the question, but I genuinely, I believe you've got to. It's both sides of the equation, and the metrics don't exist for that yet. We're going to build them.
You know, it's interesting. Something you said made me think about, right? Everyone used to measure themselves by Net Promoter Score. And I do feel that as we've been on this kind of Gen AI journey, and now, of course, more on the Agentic Commerce side, that we're hearing less about that. And I do think, David, that everyone's kind of trying to figure out what that new metric is in terms of how we measure, how we kind of stack up, and then right where we can improve. And I'm not sure if you're seeing that as well.
I am saying that. Ultimately, what we want is lots of revenue, low cost, returning customers, but there are some proxy measures on the way to get there, right? They're the signals that tell us how we're getting the big numbers that we want. And the moment that e-commerce becomes conversational commerce, one of those interim signals is, how was the interaction? How was the interaction? Was it good? Was it quick? Was it effective? Or was it poor and frustrating? So yeah, I'm agreeing with you. Maybe NPS has something in there, but it is that it's a combination of that qualitative and quantitative that's going to be the new metric here.
I think it's going to be interesting to see. As we think about, I mean, I feel like my first, like, it's called August 23 to August 24. I was like, I'm not really into kind of drama and gossip and all that. And I mean, I felt like I was just sitting there watching like a soap opera when we were, right, everyone was kind of mudslinging. And, I'd say that probably kind of also, we've seen kind of 2 of the 3 years, we've seen a lot of that. And I feel that going back to it, really, I feel started in August of 25, is that all of the platforms started to think about where they sit on a global landscape, and as opposed to kind of what all their competitors or peers are doing. And right, we've got we're just mapping for, the major AI shopping platforms here, and, kind of thinking about, their shopping styles, et cetera. As you look at it, right, kind of OpenAI is really positioned right now, right? I mean, this could all change for this like broad mid-funnel shopping behavior. Anthropic is occupying kind of this premium high consideration segment. Google is, really done a great job in terms of discovery stage shopping. And then Amazon is owning kind of like the bottom of the funnel, right? Like high intent, fast decision, ready to buy behavior. So they've all, and I think this is more just kind of them leaning into what they do best. How should a retailer think about where they should be showing up on these shopping platforms? And also, is that what they should be thinking about? What when it comes to different LLMs, what should be going through their kind of decision, mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here we're talking about off-paying, right? We're not talking about what we do on our own brand site. We're talking about visitors coming in from these other surfaces. Honestly, I wouldn't yet try to optimize for one or other. I'd be thinking about what's fundamentally needed at the foundation to optimize for agentic commerce as a whole. Each of those different AI systems that, as you say, may become stronger with different contexts, different categories, different decision styles. And that happens really fast these days, right? We saw OpenAI very early in with some shopping experiments, and then there's been a bit of a withdrawal and a retrenchment. In fact, Anthropic in even earlier, but didn't make much of it. I think the important thing is not necessarily to optimize for one, but to make sure that your catalog data is complete, accurate, not just parametric, has some use case information. So what is the product used for? How does the product relate to use cases that a consumer might be searching for? And for me, all of it starts with something of like an AO or GEO audit, right? Know where you're showing up today and why, and how in comparison to your competitors, and then use that as a data point to optimize across all of them. It's the common foundation is that structured product data, clean content, real-time feeds. It's dangerous to optimize for just one or two of these.
Yeah, because also everything is changing so rapidly. I think that's.
Oh, here we go. Yeah.
That's the challenge. I mean, David, this is a slide that you and I both love, and I think that it'll be interesting to kind of have this snapshot and then look at this in 6 and 12 months in terms of how rapidly this kind of enablement ecosystem is changing. And when we originally looked at this idea around aspiration, discovery, et cetera, right? That's where we see so much, kind of evolving right now. Checkout, we talked about this idea of this kind of frictionless, kind of seamlessness, and then, trust is really critical. And so as we think about the retailers and brands on the call here with us, what are some of the questions they should be asking of kind of current and future vendors as they either embark or continue on their agentic commerce journey?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the thought that I expressed around the difference between a prototype and a production solution. One of the greatest fears I hear, and it's founded in some well-publicized embarrassments, is an AI causing brand damage through hallucination, inaccurate information, going off piste, having inappropriate conversations. So the first question I would ask any vendor is, how is your solution really grounding itself in real data? How can you guarantee that it's not going to hallucinate? That's probably the first question.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be one I think that keeps, and I think that that's one of those things that's also, kind of held retailers back. And as we go to the next slide and think about kind of what are the kind of key, operational priorities, I think you mentioned earlier this idea around kind of, geo and SEO and how retailers and brands are showing up. And so we've looked at that as kind of one of these foundational priorities. But as you think about, right, these 5 different priorities, where are you seeing the most attention being placed right now? And once again, as we've got our eye on the prize of holiday 26, where will retailers see kind of the quickest wins?
I'm with you on number 1 there. I'm exactly with you on that. Improving product data quality. I struggle to think of any retailer I speak with that's happy with the quality of their data, and that's even thinking in a pre-AI world. That's just thinking about quality in terms of parametric completeness and SEO. But it's a different game now, because when we're searching as consumers with an AI assistant, we're searching in a different way. I think I may have given this example in the AI council that we had, which is in traditional search. If I'm looking to buy a white shirt like this, I'm generally doing more of a parametric type search. White shirt, size, single cuff, cutaway collar. But in an AI world, I might search for product. I might discover products in that way, but I might also, and the evidence is that consumers use a much longer form query, a more use-based query. I'm looking for a shirt that I can wear to work, that packs well for travel and comes out my suitcase, uncreased, needs to have a cutaway collar. It's a different type of query. So product data has taken another step up. It's not just about data completeness and accuracy and normalization. It's also about adding even more semantic information, meaningful information to that data. So I go again with GEO and that idea of auditing. Understand how you're showing up on these third-party agents, where you're showing up, what you're showing up for, where they're getting their citations from, how are your competitors showing up in comparison to you, and then use that as the basis for ensuring, first of all, that you're showing up. That's the foundation of it all. So ensuring that the data's there, the context is good, structured in a way that AI can understand. Historically, we've done that for search engines. And if e-commerce has been around for 30 years, SEO has been around for maybe 28 years. But again, hasn't fundamentally changed. It has, right? Because those of us that are old enough, I can't see any faces, but we used to be stuffing keywords into the HTML headers. Of course, now it's a lot more sophisticated. But we got that whole journey again now with AEO. And I'm convinced that everything we're doing now, when we look back in 3 years' time, is going to seem very rudimentary. But still, we have to do it. We have to pay attention to the data. That's absolutely where I'd start. Product feed, yeah. But you don't want to have a product feed until the data's right. Ad placements, capture sponsored visibility within AI native search. That's a curious one for me, because if we're talking about off-pane, we as retailers don't control that consumer surface. So that's a curious one. Retailer apps, yeah, definitely MCP server on our side, and agents behind that to be able to interact with off-pane agents. Agentify retailer digital. Yeah, I agree with these and with this order of attack.
Right. I mean, it goes back to, I think it's, there's a lot to decide right now. And I think that, whatever we can do to kind of help in terms of the order of going back to after some of the foundational, right, metrics have been decided upon and kind of who owns what, I think that's really critical. And so I think as we look at this slide, as I think about this, kind of this aspiration, checkout, and trust, and looking beyond the priorities, how do you think about, and this is very theoretical, but how do each of these kind of interact with each other? And where are you seeing that evolution, and what is, kind of slower or faster than you would have expected?
The last part of the question, Deb, was what?
Just, going back to, right, I think many folks had expected checkout to be in a different place than where it is right now. And, are there parts of this that you're seeing evolve slower or faster than expected? And if so, how is that changing the relationship between kind of aspiration, checkout, and trust?
I like the way that this is represented left to right, because that makes sense in terms of a consumer journey. And I like the terms of aspiration, checkout, trust. Also, I think there's almost a sequence vertically as well. So in that first column, aspiration, we've already talked about one of the first priorities is being discoverable. So that means not only SEO, but AO, GEO, whichever term or nuance you like. Enriching your data, location-based. That's one I know that Rezolve has solutions around. It's sort of less related to agentic, but you've got to get the data right first. Search and merch. There's obviously conversational commerce we've been talking about, but what won't go away is traditional search, at least not for a little while. Folks will still use keyword search. There's video search. There's virtual try-on. There's still a place for merchandising, of course. I mean, that's another whole topic we could talk about. How is AI on the back end? Maybe this is a future one. How is AI on the back end going to help us as operators and retailers do our job better? So I think, what are you asking here? Yeah, I think first comes discovery and visibility, then search, merchandising, checkout naturally follows next. Loyalty, for me, chronologically follows after that. Once we've got somebody through a discovery and a checkout, how can we get them coming back? So I think a successful journey starts with on the top left and ends on the far right. And like I said, you can start this right now. In fact, every one of those steps on Pain, because you control all the variables. You could probably get the discoverability, the AEO, the discoverability working pretty well now off Pain. And then as the standards mature a little bit, then checkout will follow off Pain as well.
I agree. I think, it's interesting because we've seen so much investment in not just money, but also time and loyalty. And I think this ability to start to really benefit, because so much, from different loyalty and rewards programs and, once again, gamification, I feel like we could see a much bigger impact in 26 for those retailers and brands who are leaning into agentic commerce. And that's one of the things I'm interested in seeing this holiday season. So we are going to end on this very complex slide. So David, if you can believe it, we've like gotten to the top of the hour already, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. What, to leave our audience with just kind of something to ponder, what would you say about this slide that they should be thinking about as they're, let's just say, making their operating system decisions?
Oh my goodness, there's such a lot on this slide.
I know.
But it's a great slide. It brings together a lot of key points. The first step is recognizing that this isn't just a model problem, an AI problem. That's not even just a tech problem. Risks span, well, you've got them here, data, infrastructure, integrations, permissions. Yeah, it's I'd say the more autonomy that you introduce, the more important it's going to be to have strong governance and observability as to what's going on.
No,
I think we start with the pilot. The key is, I just keep coming back to, honestly, there's such a lot there that we're going to be trying to boil the ocean if we try and do Big Bang, the BHAG, Start with a pilot, start on pain. You control all the variables, get folks across your organization used to the ideas and the concepts before you try to boil the ocean. Outline a small project, get involvement, get support, start small, move fast. It's the same sort of lessons and MO that you'd follow with any significant transformation project. Have your eye on the stars, but the first step is just getting to the moon, and that's quite a big step already.
No, that's so I think we've got I always love to leave with a checklist, and we've probably gone to the moon and back in terms of, you know, a lot of the topics that we've covered. But David, just your kind of like final words of wisdom as, you know, retailers and brands try to put this conversation into action.
Final words of wisdom. I don't know that they're necessarily words of wisdom, but I speak to a whole bunch of folks, so I sort of hear others' wisdom, and then I try to synthesize it. Let's see what you've got here. It's going to sound like some similar themes. Is your business ready today? Is it ready today to operate in this world where AI is part of the customer journey? And so that includes off pain, of course, folks that are starting the discovery off pain, but also on pain. And it's more than just having a chatbot. People think it's a chatbot, but it starts with that understanding how you're showing up today. So GEO audit, how you're showing up, where. That's something Rezolve can do. It means having machine readable product information, access to product information that isn't just parametric. Is your site aware? Does your site work with agents? Yeah, I think that's a secondary step. Can your site automatically adapt itself to the customer? Yeah, we could work up a checkbox actually, almost as a workbook, if you like, that folks might be interested in. That might be quite interesting. But the main themes are here. If I had to leave with 3 thoughts, I'd be saying that we've got to look at this through the right lens. I said earlier, it's not just a UX trend. This is much deeper. It's a transformation. Second, it's not just a better search experience, because AIs are now starting to influence decisions and taking us towards transactions. And thirdly, it's, you know, we've taken 30 years of e-commerce to get to where we are now, but the next phase isn't going to take 30 years. I think that, you know, in 1 year, these new ways of shopping are going to be not uncommon. And in 2 years, it'll be the norm. And I think actually quite soon after that, we'll be looking back on the first 30 years and thinking it was all a bit rudimentary, you know, clicking and clacking and buttons and filters.
I think well said. I'm going to leave it with that. I apologize to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. The questions that we did, thank you very much. And David, this is truly a pleasure. I learned a lot, and also learned just how much opportunity there is for this holiday season and beyond. So thanks for your time, and look forward to spending more time with you. Thanks.
Likewise. Thank you so much for inviting me, Deborah, and so thank you for all the questions as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.